Welcome everyone to this Geometry Nodes for Beginners Blender tutorial series. So in this 6-part Blender tutorial series, I'm going to show you how to use Geometry Nodes for beginners. Now, if you're a complete beginner to Blender and you've never used Blender before, then I think it is a good idea to watch some beginner tutorials and just learn the very basics of Blender, like the basic interface and some basic 3D modeling and basic shortcut keys. But as long as you know the basics of Blender, then this tutorial series is geared for beginners and it's geared for complete beginners on the topic of geometry nodes. So here's an overview of what you'll learn in the tutorial series. So in part 1, I'll be explaining what geometry nodes are, and geometry nodes is basically just a modifier that you add to objects. And I'll be showing you some very basic things, like using geometry nodes to change the geometry, to add some different effects to the geometry, and also to move geometry around. And I'll also be covering a few shortcut keys and how to navigate using the nodes in the geometry node editor. And then in part 2, we're going to be creating a cool little geometry node setup where you can draw curves and then the curves become a flower. So in part 2, we'll start by adding a curve object, and then we'll also be creating a leaf object, and I'll show you how to add the leaves onto the curve. Then in part 3, we're going to be creating a flower with the geometry nodes, and then we'll be adding the flower to the top of our curve. Then in part 4, I'll show you a few more details, like making the curve thicker as it goes down. I'll also show you how to control where the leaves are placed on the curve. And I'll be showing you how to add materials to a geometry node setup. And I'll also show you how to draw curves so that you can just draw the curves and then generate different flowers. And then in part 5, I'm going to show you how to add custom values so that you can just use the geometry nodes on the modifier side panel and you can edit the flowers. Then in part 6, I'm going to show you how to distribute all of the flower objects on a plane to kind of make like a meadow scene with some flowers. And we'll be using a separate geometry node setup to put the flowers on the plane. Now real quick before we continue, these free tutorials are made possible thanks to my supporters. So if you'd also like to help support me and this channel to help me keep on creating these free tutorials, some great ways to do that are by checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, where you can get access to 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node setups, and much more Blender content on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And you can also purchase the finished flower project files of this tutorial series on my Gumroad and Patreon. I'll have the links in the description, and you can use that for study material as you're learning the basics of geometry nodes. Alright, so here I am in a new scene in Blender, and the Blender version that I'm currently using is version 4.0.2. That is currently the latest stable version as I film this video. And I'm going to also have my screencast keys here in the corner so that you can see what buttons I'm pressing during the video. So now let's start with the fundamentals of this video, which is what is geometry nodes? Well, geometry nodes is actually a modifier which edits the mesh of an object. So it's called geometry nodes because you're using nodes to edit the geometry of a mesh. So to add geometry nodes to an object, you just want to select the mesh object, and we can click over here on this little wrench icon on the side panel, and this is the modifier properties. So you can click on add modifier and you can add different modifiers to this object. So for example, if I click here on the search, I could add like a bevel modifier, and you can see now the bevel modifier is added to this object, and so this modifies the geometry. And there's different settings you can change, like the amount and the segments. There's also another common one you could add. If you go to the add menu, you could search for the subdivision surface and just add the subdivision surface modifier, and this is going to smooth out the mesh. You can edit like the levels viewport and the render values to kind of smooth out the mesh. So geometry nodes is a modifier just like these other modifiers. So if I just click on the X here to get rid of this, I can click on add modifier, and you can see because geometry nodes is a common modifier to add, they have a shortcut right here to just add geometry nodes. So we've added geometry nodes, but you can see the modifier hasn't done anything, and that's because we haven't actually added any geometry nodes data. So let's click on the new button here to add new geometry nodes to the object. So I'll click on new, and now we have geometry nodes. And you can rename this geometry nodes data if you want to, because within one Blender file, you can actually have multiple different geometry node setups. So right here, I could type in geometry nodes 1, and then you can see there's a drop down here, and this is going to show you all of the different geometry nodes that you have in your scene. But right now I just have one. Now to edit the geometry nodes, we can't really do much right here. This is kind of just showing the geometry nodes. You can open these little arrow arrows here, but you can see there's not really many settings. So to edit the geometry nodes, we need to go to a new workspace. So there's two ways to get to the geometry nodes editor so that you can actually use the nodes within the geometry nodes. One way to do it is to split the Blender window here and then add a new window, which is geometry nodes. So to do that, you can hover your mouse here in any corner, and you can see there's that little like plus icon there, like a crosshair, and you can click and then drag out into the workspace, and that is going to split the workspace. So you can see we now have two 3D viewports. But then each one of these windows here, you can see like right here, there's this little button here, and like right over here on the outliner, there's this button here. We can use these to change the editor types. So if I just click right here, instead of it being the 3D viewport, I can change this to the geometry node editor. And if you click with your middle mouse wheel to move around, you can see there are now two different nodes. Now, another way to get to this is to just go to the geometry nodes workspace. So right up here, you can see there are different workspaces. So for instance, if you're doing sculpting, you could jump over here and it will take you into sculpt mode. Or if you click here on UV editing, there's like a UV editor. Well, there's actually a geometry nodes workspace right here. So you can click on this and it's going to show you a geometry nodes workspace. And if you don't have this geometry node workspace for some reason, you can scroll with your mouse wheel and go over to this plus icon. And then you can click on the plus icon to add a new workspace. Now, to add a geometry nodes workspace, you can go here to general, and then you can add geometry nodes. Now, your geometry nodes workspace will probably look much more like this. So you can see there's actually a 3D viewport right up here. Then right here, there is geometry nodes. And then right over here, there is also this other option here, and this is the spreadsheet. Now, why my geometry nodes workspace looks different is just because I've customized my default Blender startup file so that it looks a little bit different. Now, this right over here, this spreadsheet, beginners really don't need this data. This is really used for more complex geometry node setups. And this is basically going to give you more data within your geometry nodes. So you can see there is mesh right here, and this is like giving you the mesh data. And this cube here is going to have different vertices on each corner. So if you select the cube and then go into edit mode by hitting the tab key, you can see there are going to be different points here. And so these points are actually being displayed right here, and there's actually position values for where these points are. So if I select this point here and then hit G to grab and move it around, you can see this is point 2, and then you can see there are all of the X, Y, and Z values for where the point is. So if I move the point closer to the center of the 3D scene, if I stick it right in there, you can see the point is going to be much closer to 0. And if I bring it in the very center, it's going to be almost 0. However, if I move this point out by hitting the G key to grab and moving it way out, you can see these numbers here are going to become bigger. So these options here are really just used for more complex geometry nodes, but for most things, you really aren't going to need the spreadsheet. So if you want to close the spreadsheet, then you can click right here when the crosshair appears in the corner, and you can hold down your mouse, and then you can click and drag over, and then you can drag back. So you can see whichever area is dark, that's what window it's going to close. And you can see your mouse is also turned into an arrow. So then if I just let go, that is going to close that workspace. So I like to have the 3D viewport right over here and the geometry nodes editor right over here, but you can set up your workspace however you want. And on default, there are two nodes that the geometry nodes have added. There is the group output and the group input. Now, these little boxes right here, these are the nodes. And so if you just click and drag on the nodes, you can move them around. And then also here in the geometry nodes editor, if you scroll with your mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out. And if you click down with your middle mouse wheel, you can move around to preview the geometry nodes. Now you can see that these nodes have these little dots here, these little points, and then the points have these wires, and the wires are connected up to the other nodes. And so the wires are how the different nodes communicate. So different nodes have different values, and they have different tools and things that they do. And then you can use the wires and you can plug each node up to each other, and then that's how they communicate. So this group input value is going to be any data which is in your 3D scene. So this cube here, this is the data of the group input, because if I go into edit mode, you can see this is the geometry of the cube. Now the group output is going to take any data which you have before the group output, and it's going to actually apply it to the object. So for example, we could add a new node in here, and we could add the node in between these two nodes and stick it here in this wire, and then that would edit the actual geometry, and then when it goes to the group output, it'll actually apply it here to the object. So a really easy example is to go to the add menu. So to go to the add menu, you can press Shift A or click here on add. So when you press Shift A, there's going to be many different nodes, and Geometry Nodes really has a ton of different nodes, and you can see they're all cataloged into these different categories. What I'm going to do is go up here to the search. Now to search for a node, you can either click on the search, or after you press Shift A, you can just directly start to type. So what I'm going to do is start to type sub for subdivision surface, and you can see because I started to type, it automatically went to the search. So you can see there are many different options here it's giving us. We want to add the subdivision surface. So let's click on the subdivision surface, and then you can see now it is following your mouse. So you can just drop it wherever you want, but if you hover it over the wires, you can see the wire is going to turn that white color. And if you click there to place it, now you can see that this data here, which is the cube, that is going into the subsurf, and then there's different values to control to actually edit the subsurf, and then the final mesh is going into the geometry so that it can show up on the object. So this subdivision surface node is pretty similar to the same subdivision surface modifier that we added earlier. So there are different settings here like the level, and the level is going to be the amount of detail. So I can click on the arrows here to turn it up and down. So maybe I'll turn this up to like a 4, so it is pretty detailed. And then there's also a few other settings, and if I actually click here on the end and then drag it over, I can make it a bit bigger. So there's also the edge crease, so you can just click and then drag on this value to make it bigger or smaller. So if I turn the edge crease up, now you can see that the cube looks much more like a cube, but then the actual subdivision is smoothing out the edges. Or I can turn this down and it's going to be more like a circle. Now you can also click on a value, and if you click on it, you can actually type in a specific value. So I could then type in like 0.5 and then hit enter, and then that'll change to 0.5, or you can also drag these values. So now you can see we have a cube, but the cube looks kind of subdivided on the edges so that it is smooth. Now another node that we could add is the shade smooth node, because let's say I want to shade smooth the edges here, because right now it looks kind of rough. So if I again press Shift A for the add menu, we want to shade the object smooth, so I could start to type in set shade smooth, and we have a set shade smooth node. Now I want to put it here in between the subdivision surface and the group output. And why I'm doing that is because the nodes communicate from left to right, just like if you're reading. So again, we start with the group input, then we go next to the subsurf, and then right after that, I want to shade it smooth after I subdivide it. So we're going to stick it right here after the subsurf, but before the group output. So stick it here. So again, it reads from left to right. So it does this one, then it does this one, and then this one, and then finally the last one. So because we added the set shade smooth, it's telling it to smooth the geometry after it subdivides it. And also here on the level, I could turn this maybe up even higher to like a 6. So now you can see we have a cube with smooth edges. Now there's a few more useful things to know to navigate in the Geometry Nodes editor. So if you just click and drag, you can see there's going to be a box, and you can click and drag over the different nodes and then let go, and that will select both of them. And then you can just click and drag and move them around. You can also click on a node, and then you can hold down the Shift key and then select multiple nodes, and then you can move them around. And just like in the 3D viewport in Blender, you can use S to scale, you can use R to rotate, and you can use G to grab. You can use those same shortcut keys in the Geometry Nodes editor. So you could hit R to rotate, and you can see it's going to rotate the 2 nodes that are selected, and scaling won't really work because you don't really need to scale the nodes. You can click and drag to make them bigger or smaller, but then G for grab will move the nodes around. So if you like click and drag and box select all the nodes, then you can hit G to grab and move them around. Now regarding these wires here, you can unplug them by clicking on the end of the wire and dragging out, and now the wire is unplugged, and then if you let go, it'll just remove it. And the starting of the wire is going to be over here on the left, because again, you read from left to right, so it starts over here, and then it goes right and right and right, and it reads all the nodes. So this is going to be the ending of the node, and this is going to be the starting. You can see if I try to pull out a wire here, it's not going to remove the wire, it's going to add a new wire. So you can unplug a node by just clicking here and then letting go to get rid of it, and you can see because this wire has been unplugged, these nodes are not communicating anymore. And because they're not communicating, you can see it looks as though the mesh has disappeared. The mesh is still there. You can see if I move it around, that little origin point is still there, but because the nodes aren't communicating, the other nodes don't have any data of what the original mesh was. So then to plug back up the wire, you can click here to pull out a wire, and then you can drag over here, and you can see it's going to connect, and then if you let go, it'll connect it up. And so now now the nodes are communicating. Now you can also cut wires, and to cut wires you're going to hold down the control key and then you're going to right click and drag. And when you control right click and drag, you can see this little knife tool comes up and you can drag over a wire and then let go, and then that is going to cut the wire. Now you may have also noticed when I was dragging out the wire, if I drag out a wire but then don't plug it up to anything, if I just let go like right up here, you can see it's going to go to the add menu. And so what this is it's going to add a node wherever the end of the wire was. So for instance, I could search again for that subdivision surface modifier, and you can see here it is. So it says subdivision surface in gray, and then it says mesh. So I'll click here, and now you can see because I let go right there, it's going to add the subdivision surface after the wire. So this is really useful for creating geometry node setups. So for example, I could drag out here, let go, and then I could search for the subdivision surface, drop it here. Then I could click out here again and let go, and I could again search for like the same set shade smooth, and I could click on this and then drop it here. And then I could do this again, so I could drag out, let go, and I could add another one which we'll be using later in the series, like the instance on points. Now I want to delete these nodes, so to delete them, just like the 3D viewport in Blender, you can select the node and hit the delete key, or you can select the node and hit the X key. So X or delete is going to delete the nodes. Now the cool thing about geometry nodes is that it's not limited to this one object, because as I mentioned earlier, it is a modifier. So because it's a modifier, you could add it to multiple objects. So for example, I will press Shift A here in the 3D viewport, and I'm going to go here to mesh, and then I will add this monkey head, and I will hit G to grab and move the monkey head up here. So now I could add the same geometry nodes modifier to this monkey head. So if I click on the monkey head and then click here on add modifier, here on the modifiers, I can add geometry nodes. Now to add the old geometry nodes that we added, we can click here on the drop down and it will show us all of the geometry nodes in our scene. So I will choose geometry nodes 1. And you can see that it has now done the same exact thing to the cube. So it has added the subsurf and the set shade smooth. And why it can still look like a monkey head but have the same modifier is because of this group input. So the group input is just using any data that is actually on the 3D mesh. And I'm actually going to turn the subsurf level down because it is a little bit high detail, so I'll turn this maybe down to a 3. But then I could edit the geometry nodes. So for example, I could change this edge crease here, and because the geometry nodes is added to both of these objects, when I edit this subdivision surface here or edit the geometry nodes, it's going to affect both objects, because again, it's just a modifier that you can add to any object. So let's actually rename this modifier. So if I click here on geometry nodes, I could rename this to subsurf and smooth. So I'm going to rename it to subsurf and smooth. So now we have just created our first geometry nodes modifier, and that is a modifier created with geometry nodes that will subdivide the mesh and smooth it. So now any other object, like if I press Shift A, I can go down here and add like a cylinder, and I could also press Shift A, go to mesh, let's add an icosphere. Now any object which I add this modifier to, it will add the subsurf and smooth it. So if I click here on this object, let's add modifier, we can add geometry nodes. We can choose the drop down, and then we can choose subsurf and smooth, and now it's doing the same thing. And then this one here, add modifier, geometry nodes, click on the drop down and choose the subsurf and smooth. Now there's another really useful node which I want to show you, which is great for beginners, and that is the transform geometry. So if you go to the add menu by pressing Shift A, you can find it here, but I just prefer to use the search just because I always have specific nodes that I'm looking for. So I can just start to type transform, and you can see here's the transform geometry node. So when you are transforming data in Blender, that is going to affect the location, the rotation, and scale. You can see here it's called translation, but that's the same as location. So what we can do is we can put this transform geometry somewhere in our geometry node setup. So you could really add it over here at the end, over here at the starting. It really doesn't matter in this geometry node setup, but I'm just going to add it to the starting. So first it's going to move the geometry, then it's going to subdivide it, and then it's going to shade it smooth. So I'm just going to click on the transform geometry, and I can hover it over the wire, and the wire turns white, and then if I let go, we have now dropped it in here. So it hasn't done anything yet, and that is because these values are the default. So I can now use the X translation to move that over, and the Y and the Z. And if I just like give each one of these objects random rotations, let me just kind of rotate these objects and move them around. Now if I change the X translation, you can see it's going to move each object over by its X-axis. Because we've rotated the objects, the X-axis is changing for each object. So I can move this, I could also rotate it if I wanted to, and I could also scale it. And to scale all of these values at once, not just the X, Y, and Z, but all of them at once, you can click on the first one, and then you can drag down, and then after that you can drag left and right. So I could like make this smaller or bigger. So as you can see, this transform geometry node is super useful because you can move around the mesh. All right, so before we finish this part, there's one more concept that I want to explain within geometry nodes. So this group input, as I mentioned, it uses the geometry which is in the 3D viewport. So if I go into edit mode by hitting the tab key, you can see there is the original mesh. So that is the original mesh that we had before we used geometry nodes. But then, you know, we've transformed it, so we've moved it up. We've also added the subsurf and we've set it shade smooth. Well, with geometry nodes, you don't actually need to use the group input. So if you don't want to use the actual geometry in the 3D viewport, if you want to just start over completely, you can just use a different geometry. So if you select the group input, you can hit the X key to just delete it. And now you can see, because it's not using the original geometry of the object, it appears as though the geometry is gone. However, if I were to delete this modifier, if I hit the X here to delete the modifier, then the object would be back because the geometry isn't actually deleted, it's just being hidden from the modifier. So let me press Ctrl Z to undo that because I still want this set up. So because we don't have any geometry, we need to add some new geometry. So within geometry nodes, you can actually add default primitive objects. So if I press Shift A for the add menu here in the geometry nodes editor, I could go to mesh, and then I could go to primitives, and you can see there are the different primitive objects that you can add in the 3D viewport. So there's the cone, the cube, and the cylinder, and all the other ones. So I'm just going to add a cube, for example. So we'll add a cube and we can drop it here. So now instead of using a 3D mesh of a cube, we can use a cube node in the geometry nodes. Now the nodes are not communicating, so it's still disappearing. So to give the transform geometry the cube data, we can pull out a wire from the mesh and we can stick it into the geometry. And now we have a cube which is completely in geometry nodes. And then you could change the size of the cube by dragging these values, and you could also subdivide it by adding the different vertices here. If I hold down the Z button and move my mouse to go into wireframe, you can see I can change the vertices X, Y, and Z, and that is basically going to subdivide that cube. And if I zoom out here, you can see that the other objects that I've added have turned into a cube. So even though this was originally a cylinder, and this was originally an icosphere and a cube and a monkey, they have all turned into cubes because they all have the same modifier. And so we're basically telling it to not use the original geometry, so it's ignoring the original geometry and it's instead just using a cube. If I go into edit mode of these objects, you can actually see the original geometry as a wireframe, but I'm not using the original geometry because I deleted the group input and I'm instead replacing it for a cube. Alright, so this is going to wrap it up for part 1 of my tutorial series on geometry nodes for beginners. So I hope you were easily able to understand, and I hope you were easily able to follow along, and thank you for watching. So in the next part, in part 2, we're going to start by creating our geometry nodes curve flower modifier. And I'll be uploading one part each day of the tutorial series, so when part 2 is released, it's going to be right up there on the end screen and also the link in the description. And if you found this video helpful and you'd like to help support me and this channel, then a great way to do that is by checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, where you can get access to the finished project files of this tutorial that you can use as study material. And also on my Gumroad store and Patreon page, you can get access to 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node setups, and much more Blender content on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And all of your support really does help me to keep on creating these free tutorials. So I hope you enjoyed this, thank you for watching, and I will see you in part 2.